Russian soldiers killed or wounded. That is not a typo. That is not an exaggeration. That is the official count. General Alexander Syrski, covering December 2025 through the end of February 2026. A single winter. A staggering, almost incomprehensible toll. Something else was happening. Something that nobody in Moscow saw coming. Ukraine wasn't just holding the line. It was launching a counterattack. And for the first time in over a year, Ukraine is living. Russia has officially lost the winter war. And the consequences of that loss are going to echo across the entire 2026 campaign. If you're new here, welcome. You're watching World Brief Daily. Headlines, not just the spin, but the numbers, the context, and what it all actually means. If you want to stay ahead on everything happening in this war, subscribe right now and hit the notification bell. Let's begin with what may be the most devastating set of numbers to come out of this war in months. 92,850. Say it slowly. That is the number of Russian soldiers killed into February 2026. General Syrski laid out those figures publicly, and the math is brutal. It amounts to an average of 1,031 Russian troops eliminated every single day per day, in a season that Russia had specifically planned to use as the foundation for a triumphant 2026 campaign. And now, for the wider context that makes these numbers even more staggering, Russia was losing approximately 40,000 soldiers per month between November and January. That figure is even higher than the Ukrainian military's own estimates. The outlet reported in February full-scale invasion began, Russia is now officially recruiting fewer volunteer soldiers than it is losing on the battlefield. The recruitment shortfall isn't just a logistical headache. It is true that Russia fails to recruit is one less reserve for the spring and summer offensives that Putin has been banking everything on. Those reserves are going in now ahead of schedule, and many of them are dying. The equipment losses Russia sustained over the winter are in a category of their own. 322 tanks vanished from the Russian order of battle in just 3 months. At first glance, Russia is producing and rebuilding only around 400 tanks per year in total. And of those, many are refurbished Soviet-era T-80s rather than the newer T-90s, which Russia makes annually. In other words, 3 months of winter nearly wiped out a full year's worth of tank production. That's before you count the 430 armored combat vehicles destroyed, the smoking wreckage, and the extraordinary figure of 2,967 units of artillery wiped out over the same period. When you add the 11,927 additional vehicles that Russia has increasingly relied upon as its armored fleets have been gutted, the picture becomes clear. Russia entered the winter with a war machine. It came out of the winter significantly degraded. Ukraine crippled 55 Russian air defense systems, opening up safer corridors for drone and missile operations. 5 Russian aircraft went down. A helicopter was destroyed. On the drone front, 9 Russian drones were eliminated, units that Russia had been counting on for surveillance, strike operations, and frontline coordination. And Ukraine, a country that barely has a functioning navy, still continuing to dismantle what remains of the Black Sea Fleet, a force that has already been driven so far from its former operational base that it has virtually no presence in the Black Sea anymore. Daily, and if you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment. Every day, this war produces developments that reshape the entire picture. We break them down so you don't have to piece it together from a dozen different... And let's keep going. None of what just described was supposed to happen this way. Russia had a very specific strategy for the winter of 2025 into early 2026, and it was out February 26th. The strategy was not primarily military, it was psychological. It was designed to break Ukrainian society from the inside out. The plan was relentless bombardments and drones targeting power stations, heating systems, and the industrial backbone that keeps the country alive. The goal, as the Atlantic Council described it, was to make Ukraine a nation so devastated by the absence of heat, electricity, and basic services that its leadership would have no rational choice but to seek terms. As the Council reported, the Kremlin hoped to take the terms of peace by stripping Ukraine of its industrial capacity and destroying the minimum standard of living for its civilian population. And Russia did not hold back on this front. President Zelensky, Russia launched 738 missiles, 14,670 guided aerial bombs, and nearly 19,000 attack drones at Ukrainian territory. The single 700 aerial targets in one coordinated attack, including more than 50 missiles, all aimed at infrastructure. That is not a military operation. That is a terror campaign. But here is where Ukraine absorbed the strikes. Its people endured, its military held, and as the Atlantic Council noted, with spring approaching, Ukraine will now be able to dedicate the warmer months to winter trying to destroy. Russia spent enormous resources, financial, material, and strategic, trying to freeze Ukraine into submission, and Ukraine is still standing. That is the fundamental terms of what Russia set out to achieve. Meanwhile, on the ground, the situation for Russia was deteriorating with remarkable speed. The Institute for the Study of War, widely known as ISW, January and February. According to the ISW, between January 1st and February 19th, Russian forces seized only 572 square kilometers of Ukrainian miles. The open-source intelligence monitoring project Deep State, which is associated with Ukraine's Ministry of Defense, reported even lower figures. According to Deep State, kilometers in January and a pitiful 126 square kilometers in February. That February figure representing the smallest monthly Russian gain since July 2024. February, Russia captured roughly 430 square miles of Ukrainian territory in exchange for 92,850 casualties. That works out to approximately 200 gain. Russia was paying with the lives and bodies of its soldiers at a rate that makes even the most brutal calculations of military history look unthinkable. And critically, it was slowing down, while its losses continued to compound. Russia Matters, which tracks ISW data systematically, confirmed that over the past 12 months, Russia's average monthly territorial gain was approximately, but in February 2026 alone, that figure collapsed. According to ISW's analysis, cited by the Washington Post, Ukraine liberated more land in the final 2 weeks of February. Let that sink in. The supposed aggressor, the side that launched this war and has been pushing forward for 4 years, was net negative on territory in the final stretch of winter. This happened because it had been toward the beginning of February, Ukraine's air assault forces, working in coordination with dedicated drone units and assault groups conducting search and destroy operations, began pushing in southern and southeastern Ukraine. A major offensive along the Oleksandrivsk axis was launched and is still underway as of this recording, pushing towards Zaporizhzhia, and in the Longtiv was not just territory, it was the systematic destruction of Russian military groupings and the liberation of strategic ground that Ukraine could fortify for defensive depth across the Zaporizhzhia and Dnipropetrovsk. Counterattack had already delivered results that exceeded expectations. Ukraine had liberated 300 square kilometers, roughly 115 square miles, in a matter of weeks. Eight with a fortified defensive node and a forward launching point for deeper pushes to the south. 2 days later, on February 22nd, General Syrskyi announced that the liberated area had grown to 45 square miles, including some regions recaptured from Russian control in late January. And this is the moment that Taras Chmut, head of the Come Back Alive Foundation and a member of Ukraine, supervised in a Facebook post published on March 1st. He wrote that Russia had lost the battle for winter and Ukraine had won. In his own words, the first day of spring, the summer, Ukraine continues its fight. On the front line, for the first time in months or maybe years, we started to free up more territory than to lose. For the first time since Ukraine 2024, Ukraine is liberating more territory than Russia is capturing. The balance of this war, for this moment at least, has shifted squarely in Ukraine's favor. This is not a small thing about what Russia's winter was supposed to look like. Energy strikes breaking Ukrainian will. Ground pressure maintaining momentum toward the Donetsk fortress belt, reserves building in preparation for spring and summer offensives. Every one of those assumptions has been shattered. Russia's recruitment is falling short. Its reserves are being deployed early and being killed ahead of schedule. Its energy strikes failed to break Ukraine, and its ground forces Ukrainian counterattack that Russia never anticipated. Zelensky himself has already obtained what Russia intends to do next. And here is where it gets extraordinary. Ukraine has reportedly gotten its hands on Russia's. Speaking on March 2nd, Zelensky outlined the directions Russia intends to pursue. We understand that their directions remain relevant. The occupation of the east of our state, namely the Donetsk, to continue in the direction of the Zaporizhzhia region and also toward the Dnipro direction. It is difficult for them, but they are looking at the Odessa region. But then Zelensky added the line that cuts to the heart of have nothing in common with reality because they cannot accomplish the tasks. Russia has a plan. Ukraine knows the plan. And the winter just proved that Russia lacks the commitment for a reality check. As impressive as Ukraine's winter campaign has been, this is not the time for complacency. Russia still has over 100,000 soldiers being assembled for a major push into the world, which draws on deep state figures. Interestingly, that number is significantly smaller than the 170,000 troops Russia deployed specifically to take Pokrovsk during penetrate the broader Donetsk fortress belt, which is even more heavily fortified than Pokrovsk. With 70,000 fewer soldiers is a question that nobody in Moscow appears to be answering convincingly. But 100W has reported that Russia has already begun preliminary artillery operations in Ukraine's east, probing and softening positions in preparation for a deeper push into Donetsk. There are also Russia intends to push towards Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk during the spring and summer of 2026. Ukraine's current counterattack in the south may therefore serve a dual purpose, liberating, strictly forcing Russia to divert resources and manpower from its planned Donetsk offensive to deal with an active and energetic Ukrainian threat in the south. Every Russian soldier sent to retake liberated is available for the Donetsk push. Ukraine is playing chess. Russia appears to be playing checkers. And underlining all of this is Russia's economic crisis, a conflict as much as anything happening on the battlefield. Alexandra Prokopenko, a former Russian central bank advisor and now a fellow at the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center, published a Landby 6 that described Russia's economic situation with devastating clarity. In her words, Russia's economy has entered the death zone, a term borrowed from mountain climbing, used to describe faster than it can recover. As Fortune reported on February 22nd, Russia's GDP has stagnated, oil revenues have been cut roughly in half by Western sanctions, and the government's budget deficit. Russia's Urals crude oil was trading below $40 per barrel in December 2025 and barely above that in January 2026. Figures that give the Kremlin very little to work with financially. Per barrel deviation in the oil price costs Russia between $19 and $23 billion in annual revenue. The math is simple and the conclusion is grim. Prokopenko's most striking point is about Brexit as operating on military rent, money transferred from the state budget to defense enterprises, generating wages and activity, but producing assets that are ultimately designed to be destroyed, tanks that get shot down. Unlike oil revenue, which introduced real value into the Russian economy from outside the system, military rent is pure internal redistribution toward destruction, as its own muscle tissue for energy. Russia is not building wealth. It is burning through it. And as Fortune noted, Russian officials have privately warned Putin that a financial crisis could arrive for Putin's ability to sustain and fund a spring and summer offensive. It means that the generous bonus payments Russia has been using to attract volunteer soldiers may become increasingly difficult to sustain, because military capacity is instead flowing into equipment and personnel that Ukraine is systematically destroying. Every tank Ukraine kills costs Russia far more than the metal. It costs recruit payment that got the crew into the vehicle and the strategic reserve that was supposed to be saved for a different moment in the war. And there is one more factor hanging over Russia's spring plans, the Starlink video, and it has played a significant and often underappreciated role in enabling Ukraine's winter counterattacks. Access to Starlink for Russian drone operations and frontline communications was cut during had real, measurable consequences for Russian tactical coordination. If you want the full breakdown of the Starlink situation and what it means for Russia's over 700,000 troops in the field, we have a dedicated stand. Russia lost the winter war, not on a single front, not in a single battle, but across the entire canvas of the conflict. Its civilian terror strategy failed to break Ukraine. It's in exchange for minimal territorial gain. Its recruitment pipeline is running dry. Its economic foundations are crumbling under the combined weight of sanctions, low oil prices, and now Ukraine holds the initiative in the south, liberating territory at a rate that, for the first time in over a year, exceeds Russia's own gains. With spring arriving, Ukraine will spend maintaining frontline pressure. Russia will attempt to reconstitute forces for a major push in the east, but it will do so with fewer soldiers than planned, depleted reserves, a constrained budget, and military already countering. Zelensky knows where Russia wants to go. Ukraine's military is already moving to make sure Russia cannot get there. Russia has lost this winter, but the war is not over, and the spring effect great test. We will be here, covering every development, every breakthrough, every setback, with the depth and analysis you need to understand what is actually happening, not just what the headlines say. Is this video valuable? The single most important thing you can do is subscribe to World Brief Daily and enable notifications. We publish constantly, we go deep, and we do not cut corners. Share beyond the surface level, and make sure you check out our video on the Starlink shutdown and what it means for Russia's forces. It is one of the key pieces of this winter story that is